Hey, how are you guys today? Coming to you from my front yard. And if I keep scratching, it's because I got all those bug bites from the video the other day from the backyard. So hopefully the bugs aren't here. There's a giant black cat who lives in my front yard and thinks it's his house. So he's so confused. All right, and maybe we'll meet some neighbors. It's nice and windy tonight, and hope you guys are doing well. We're almost done. We've almost made it. Woo! Okay. All right, so today we are talking about, let me look, question number 1. What are the foreign and domestic policy successes and failures of the Bush presidency? And how was the Bush doctrine and national security strategy a departure from previous presidents' foreign policy statements? Woo! All right, there you go. So, um, remember that foreign policy is the stuff that happens at home? No, it's the stuff that happens away. Oh my gosh, I just lied to you. So foreign policy is the away stuff, and domestic policy is the home stuff. Okay, so I'll try to separate it a little bit that way, um, and just kind of give you a general overview of stuff you might want to consider talking about. Okay, so probably the first controversy in the Bush presidency is the election of George Bush. He runs against a fellow named Al Gore, who you may have heard of. He wrote a book and then produced a movie called An Inconvenient Truth, and he talks some about global warming, which you've probably heard about. He was Bill Clinton's vice president. So he runs against George Bush, who was governor of Texas. Yes, governor of Texas. A long time ago. Most people liked him, I think. But, in Texas, we need to talk about Texas politics sometime. But Texas it's kind of an odd state as far as governing. Our legislature only meets every other year, and the lieutenant governor probably has more power than the governor, and the governor's kind of like the head cheerleader. So, which was, yeah, it's good because George Bush's dad was a cheerleader. So, yell lead. I don't know, whatever you are at Yale. I guess it's an Aggie where you're a yell leader. But anyway, Bush, interesting fellow, very intelligent man. I know, it's not the general perception, but he had an undergraduate from Yale and a graduate and MBA from Harvard. And I know what you're thinking. Well, he just got in because of his dad. Yeah, probably so. But you don't get the degree. Yeah, I can't say that anymore, can I? Because of that big scandal with all the rich Hollywood type people. But those kids didn't get degrees, they just got in, remember. So you get in because of who your parents are. Generally, they don't hand out a degree because of who your parents are. So, anyway. All right, so Bush is a fairly smart guy, but that's not how he comes across. He's not a very good public speaker, and lots of people would say that it was kind of a tactic of his for campaigning because he wanted to appear more like the average person. And if he had these difficulties while he was speaking, people go like, that's just like me. So Bush. So he's very personable. People kind of like him. He'd been a rowdy dude when he was younger, but he kind of outgrew it and became a nice family kind of dude because his wife told him it's time to be a family dude. Okay, so he becomes president in a very controversial election where the state that made the difference in whether he got elected was Florida, and his brother was governor of Florida. Oops. So people thought it was a little sketchy, and people said, oh, he got selected, not elected, and the Supreme Court intervened, which is not exactly constitutional, but in the modern era, we like the Supreme Court, so we kind of allow that to happen. Anyway, so he gets elected, kind of, sort of, maybe, probably. They did recounts after they stopped doing the recounts, which is what the Supreme Court told them to do, stop doing recounts. But press agencies, newspapers in Florida did, and there's some suggestion, probably with some decent credibility, that he would have won the state of Florida, but it would have been super close. Well, anyway, he's president. He's president. And people aren't super excited. And then 9/11. And 9/11 helps us forget that we were mad about the election because 9/11 is a really big deal. So, what happens on 9/11 of 2001 is a triple terrorist attack in the United States. in New York City, Washington, D.C., and then there's a plane that crashes. A plane crashes into the Pentagon, two into the Twin Towers, and then there's one that goes down in Pennsylvania, but that was headed for the White House. So then we declare war on terror, which is kind of a mess. So your book has lots of really good detail about this, and this is pretty unusual stuff. Okay, first of all, so 9/11, that's the day. And then we figure out pretty quickly that this is a terrorist attack. At first, I remember I was teaching at Leander High School that morning, and the first terrorist attack happened early, and kids weren't there yet, and we saw it on the news. And then a second one happened pretty quickly after. At first, it's like, oh, that's a terrible plane accident, and then when it happened again, it's like, that's not an accident. So, and I remember they told us, like, don't talk to your students about this and pretend it's not happening. It's like, yeah, that's a good idea. So none of us did it. It's not why I don't work there anymore. Um, so there's how do you react? How do you react when you're attacked by terrorists, not by a nation? Well, we declare war on terror. So we do that pretty quickly. Bush gives a speech within the next week or so. It's on the 20th of September, where he says, freedom and fear at war, and we love freedom and they hate freedom. And if you are either with us or you're with the terrorists. And this establishes, this speech and some other things that happened around the same time period, establish something called the Bush Doctrine, which is the idea of a preemptive strike where we can attack people before they attack us because we know they're going to attack us. This is a new thing in foreign policy, and this is a tricky sort of thing in foreign policy because how do you know for sure that someone's going to attack you? Now, I know we have very good surveillance intelligence and information and intelligence agencies, but doesn't mean that they're foolproof because, when we go into certain places and look for weapons of mass destruction like we did in Iraq and can't find them until much, honestly, until we pull most of the troops out and they're not in Iraq anymore, the WMD. It's tricky stuff. So this is a new era in foreign policy, and typically we don't. I mean, we've done the Vietnam thing where we want to stop communism over there before it comes over here, and you hear some of the same slogans reported or used. Let's stop terrorism overseas before it comes over here. We're going to send troops into Iraq and promote regime change, which is a little controversial. Oh, there's a big bird. A little controversial because the guy who's in power, Saddam Hussein, was the guy who was still in power, or who was in power, he's still in power, but he was in power when George Bush's father was president. And some people said that, he had embarrassed Bush's father because he was able to stay in power, and that maybe part of the reason that Bush was trying to get Saddam out of power was to avenge his father. And I don't think much of that, but you can. It's completely up to you. We are going to suggest that he was a bad guy that terrorized his people and invaded other countries, which we know he'd done before, and that his state was a sponsor of terrorism. Bush is also going to declare that 3 nations in particular are sponsors of terrorism, and they are the axis of evil. And those nations are Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. So now we've kind of declared unofficial, we're not declaring war, we're not sending troops into all 3 of those countries, although clearly we did one, but we're just telling them they're on notice. Okay, so the Iraq War, and we do send troops into Afghanistan pretty quickly as well, starts end of 2001, early 2002. Saddam is going to be deposed in 2006 and then executed shortly thereafter by a tribunal of his own people. But by 2007, public opinion suggests that it's time for us to get out because, after Vietnam, we don't want to stay places too long. Now, if you're wondering, do we still have troops in Iraq and Afghanistan? I'm going to go with yes. And you'll notice in the next talk about Obama that he may take some troops out of Iraq, but he adds a whole bunch more to Afghanistan. So, and if you're wondering why Afghanistan, because we find out that that's probably where Osama bin Laden is hanging out, and we're going to try to capture him. Now, the Bush administration is going to be successful at getting rid of Saddam, but not so much at getting rid of um, Osama bin Laden. Okay, if you're wondering how the economy is going after 9/11, it's a little iffy. So we have a little downturn after 9/11, and then it's sort of a recovery. Um, we had a bit of a recession at the end of the second Clinton administration, and Bush had planned to do some Republican Reagan-like things, decrease taxes, supply side economics, that kind of thing. But then after 9/11, people also forgot about the economy being an issue. So um, other weird things going on in 2001 that I forgot to mention were a nutty dude was sending envelopes of anthrax to reporters and to politicians that he didn't necessarily like. So that was odd. And because of those attacks, and really more because of other the 9/11 foreign terrorist attacks, our government becomes increasingly serious about surveillance. Now, I wrote some stuff down here because I knew I wouldn't remember what it stood for. But we passed something called the Patriot Act, and I think we normally just think like, oh, that's just a nice title, but it stands for something. That's what I wrote down, so I'm going to look at it. It stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. And really what that allowed was for the government to surveil your social media. We didn't have as much back then, but we had some. Your phone calls, your emails, your conventional mail, to look to see if you were a terrorist. And they could use something called FISA courts, which were Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Administration courts, where they could get secret warrants, where they didn't have to have public hearings to search your house, and they didn't have to tell you they were going. So it was kind of an interesting time. The Supreme Court at times will suggest that some of this is constitutional, other parts of it are not. We're also going to open a prison camp in Guantanamo Bay, which is this odd little section of Cuba that we have control over, and we have military bases there. But we put prisoners in Guantanamo because we are going to claim that they don't have constitutional rights there. If we put them at any of our foreign prisons overseas or on U.S. soil, they would have constitutional rights. Now, later on, the Supreme Court will say, wrong. They do have constitutional rights. And there'll be lots of controversy about, is it okay to have enhanced interrogation techniques, or is that truly, is that torture? And the Bush administration will say it's not, and the other, lots of other people argue that it is, and eventually the Supreme Court is going to weigh in on the side of people having rights no matter where they're being interrogated, even if it's at Guantanamo. Other stuff, because I know I need to wrap this up, that I should probably mention to you. Oh yeah, I mentioned federal power increases. We have issues with torture. We have some foreign prisons, some in our European bases overseas, where we're going to transfer soldiers, and we will do things that are culturally inappropriate for Muslim prisoners, and then we'll do much worse stuff than that to actual torture. I mean, sometimes it's embarrassing them, having them eat things that they wouldn't culturally eat, having male prisoners have female prison guards, having them strip in front of those female prison guards, that kind of stuff, which is maybe just, like I say, culturally inappropriate. But there's actual torture, kind of shocking people and depriving them of food and pinning their arms behind their back, that sort of stuff, for hours or days, that sort of thing. So lots of controversy during that time period. Also, George Bush gets to appoint 2 new justices to the Supreme Court, and he is appointing John Roberts and Samuel Alito. Roberts replaces Sandra Day O'Connor, who's fairly moderate, and Roberts becomes, Alito replaces O'Connor, and Roberts replaces William Rehnquist, who had been the Chief Justice and was incredibly conservative. So he replaces Alito's incredibly conservative, and Roberts is a fairly moderate kind of guy. Most important guy in the Supreme Court during that era is Anthony Kennedy, because he really is the only moderate on the court. And I'm not really sure we have a true moderate anymore. Maybe John Roberts, who's the Chief Justice, but most people would argue he's a little more conservative than moderate. The economy starts to go a little soft. At the end of the second Bush administration, he gets 2 terms. And it is primarily because of something called the housing bubble. And we'll talk more about that with the Obama talk. But banks had decided that to make sure everyone could afford a home, because it's the American dream, that they would give unusual loans. And these unusual loans would have really low interest rates at the beginning, or they would have just a normal interest rate, and then they would have a balloon payment. So you could afford your house for about 4 or 5 years, and then once that 4 or 5 years was up, then your house payment became super, super expensive. And the thought was, and people always think this, I don't make that much money now, but in 5 years I'm going to be a multimillionaire. We all think our income will always increase, and the banks felt like this wasn't such a bad thing, because if they couldn't pay their loan, then no harm, no foul. They would just take the house back and sell it to someone else, which is what they did. So the banks didn't lose money, but people lost their homes, and home builders actually lost out on this too, because people were not able to stay in the homes, and reselling relatively new homes became more common. But it was hard on the real estate industry. It wasn't hard on the banking industry, because banks usually get bailed out. So but it's very hard on the economy, and lots of people, and I know it was a big problem in this area as well. And maybe your parents remember it too, but I had lots of friends who honestly made less money than I did, and bought, you can see my fancy house in the background, bought much nicer houses than I have. Mine is very nice, I'm not complaining. But they spent, 2 times as much on their house as I did, as my husband and I did, and made less money. And in 5 years, they didn't have their house anymore. So it was a rough time. It was. And the economy got really bad, which pretty much ensured that we weren't going to elect another Republican, because once the economy gets bad, yeah, we got to try again. All right, I got to finish this up, so I'm going to be done. Plus, there are dudes riding their bikes down the street and popping wheelies. It's quite impressive. Sorry that you didn't get to see it. All right. Good luck on the Bush question. Let me know if you have any questions. I put some resources in, on the assignment for you. Be sure and check those out. All right. Good luck. Bye.